June 19, 1944. The Philippine Sea. The sky is a blinding blue sheet, split by the distant hum of radial engines. Below, the Pacific glitters like molten glass, broken only by the dark silhouettes of American carriers cutting slow arcs through the waves. From the east, dozens of Japanese Zero fighters dive out of the sun. Their mission? Intercept what their intelligence calls slow-moving American dive bombers. The pilots expect easy kills. One burst, one plume of smoke. But within seconds, confusion spreads through the formation. The bombers don't dive away. They climb. Their wings flex under the strain as massive Wright engines roar to life, pulling them skyward with a force no one expected. Tracers streak past. A Zero follows, but stalls out, left behind in its own wake. One Japanese pilot radios in disbelief. "These planes! They're climbing like fighters." In that moment, the myth of Japanese air superiority begins to unravel, and the age of American dominance in the Pacific sky truly begins. When the Pacific War began in December 1941, Japan's air forces stood unrivaled across Asia. The Mitsubishi A6M-0 dominated the skies with unmatched agility, long range, and the terrifying precision of its pilots. The Zero's lightweight frame and enormous fuel efficiency gave it an advantage that stunned Allied pilots flying slower, heavier aircraft. In the early months of the war, Japan's mastery in aerial combat seemed absolute. The United States entered this new kind of air war at a disadvantage. Its Navy and Marine pilots faced enemies who could outmaneuver them, outclimb them, and strike first. Yet, what the Japanese never anticipated was America's ability to learn fast, adapt quickly, and build relentlessly. By 1942, the U.S. Navy introduced a weapon that would quietly redefine air combat: the Douglas SBD Dauntless Dive Bomber. It wasn't sleek like the Zero, nor fast on paper, but it was strong, steady, and devastatingly accurate. It could dive vertically at more than 250 knots, drop a bomb directly on a ship's deck, and then pull out safely thanks to reinforced dive brakes and rugged construction. During the Battle of Midway in June 1942, dauntless crews from squadrons like VB-6 and VS-6 changed the course of the war. Within a few minutes, their bombs tore through the flight decks of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. Japan lost 3 carriers in one morning, and with them, much of its experienced aircrew. That single strike proved that dive bombing, when paired with courage and precision, could shatter even the most powerful fleet. But the Dauntless was only the beginning. As the war pressed deeper into the Pacific, American engineers and tacticians pushed for faster, stronger aircraft that could carry heavier loads and survive longer missions. The result was the Curtiss SB2C Helldiver, a machine that would test pilots' patience and enemy endurance alike. Early Helldivers were plagued by problems. They were heavy, hard to handle on takeoff, and despised by some naval aviators. Yet beneath its flaws lay raw power. Its 1,900 horsepower Wright R-2600 twin cyclone engine gave it climbing strength no Japanese pilot had ever encountered from a bomber. When tuned properly, and in the hands of a trained pilot, it could climb faster than the very fighters sent to destroy it. By 1944, the U.S. Navy had refined its dive bomber doctrine to perfection. No longer were these planes merely ship killers. They were symbols of American industrial superiority, products of a nation that could outbuild and outthink its enemy. Each new model rolled off the production line with better engines, stronger wings, and improved bomb sights. And as the Zero's design reached its limits, Japan faced an engineering wall. Lightweight construction meant no armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no margin for survival. What once gave the Zero its agility now became its greatest weakness. American dive bombers, slower on paper, could dive steeper, hit harder, and, most shockingly, climb faster. when powered by the new generation of radial engines. By the time the Philippine Sea battle began, the tables had turned completely. What the Japanese pilots believed were easy prey were now apex predators, products of a relentless American war. Machine that combined engineering discipline with brutal efficiency. And that transformation didn't happen overnight. It began in the laboratories and factories long before the Pacific skies filled with contrails. The transformation of America's dive bombers from slow, defensive aircraft to fast, climbing predators was not an accident. It was the result of methodical engineering and industrial will. When Curtiss engineers first proposed the SB2C Helldiver in 1938, few realized how radical the design truly was. The aircraft's power plant, the Wright R-2600 twin cyclone, was a technological leap. With 14 cylinders arranged in 2 rows and supercharged to handle high altitudes, it produced nearly 1,900 horsepower, more than twice that of early Japanese engines. Its successor, the R-2800 Double Wasp, would later power the F-6F Hellcat and the F-4U Corsair, pushing climb rates to levels no Japanese aircraft could match. American designers understood that war in the Pacific was about range, survivability, and performance under stress. They didn't need the lightest aircraft. They needed the toughest. The Helldiver's reinforced wings could withstand violent pullouts at over 300 knots. Hydraulic dive brakes allowed it to descend vertically without losing control. Most importantly, its engine could push it back up into the sky, a feat that shocked every Zero pilot who expected it to stall and fall. While Japan's production relied on hand assembly and precision craftsmanship, the United States relied on volume and standardization. Factories in New York, Ohio, and California produced thousands of engines and airframes with exact tolerances. Mechanics could replace parts interchangeably in the field, a luxury Japan could never match. But engineering alone didn't change the war. Doctrine did. American tacticians rewrote how dive bombers operated. Instead of diving alone or in loose formations, they coordinated with fighter escorts and torpedo planes in layered attacks. The concept of the fast bomber emerged, aircraft that could strike, climb, and regroup before the enemy could respond. Japanese intelligence reports from 1943 reveal growing confusion. Intercepted radio transmissions described American bombers that climb as fighters do. Japanese engineers at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal dismissed the claims as exaggerations, until combat footage and recovered aircraft parts proved otherwise. By late 1943, Japan's once feared A6M-0 was losing its edge. Allied pilots learned to exploit its weaknesses: a fragile frame, poor dive recovery, and limited protection. As U.S. aircraft grew faster and heavier, Japanese pilots were forced into defensive combat they could no longer control. At the same time, American aviators grew bolder. Many had begun their training after Midway, taught by survivors who had witnessed both defeat and triumph. They understood the Zero's psychology: strike first, retreat fast, and avoid prolonged climbs. The Helldiver and Dauntless, with their new engine performance, turned that logic on its head. Now, when Japanese fighters dove in, the bombers could climb, not flee. It was more than a technical advantage. It was psychological warfare in the sky. Each failed interception eroded Japan's confidence. Each successful climb reinforced America's growing belief that it could dominate the Pacific not just through numbers, but through innovation. By the spring of 1944, this quiet revolution in air combat was about to be tested on a massive scale. The largest carrier battle in history was about to unfold. And for the first time, Japanese pilots would meet American dive bombers that defied everything they thought they knew about physics and flight. The battle would not only decide control of the Mariana Islands, it would decide who truly ruled the air over the Pacific. At first glance, the Helldiver didn't look like a game-changer. It was bulky, had long folding wings, and was heavier than any dive bomber before it. But hidden beneath its steel frame was a quiet revolution in aeronautical design. The secret wasn't in its speed. It was in how it managed power and lift. American engineers learned to exploit the full potential of supercharged radial engines, which could maintain power even in steep climbs. The Curtiss SB2C Helldiver's Wright R-2600 could deliver over 1,900 horsepower at sea level, while the later R-2800-equipped variants reached climb rates exceeding 2,200 feet per minute. Compared to the A6M0's climb rate of around 3,100 feet per minute, the difference seemed small on paper. But the Helldiver could sustain its climb far longer, even after a high-speed dive or bomb release, something the Zero's air-cooled Sakai engine could not. Engineers also refined the shape of the Helldiver's fuselage and the design of its dive brakes. The airframe could handle terminal dives from 10,000 feet and recover at 2,000 without losing structural integrity. That strength came at a cost, weight, but it allowed American pilots to perform maneuvers that would have torn Japanese aircraft apart. Tactically, this power changed everything. The U.S. Navy's dive-bombing squadrons adopted coordinated strike-and-climb tactics. Instead of diving in isolation, bomber groups attacked in sequence, releasing their payloads, then climbing at steep angles to regroup under the cover of altitude and escort fighters. This tactic turned the expected rhythm of air combat upside down. Japanese pilots trained to exploit weakness after a dive, to catch bombers as they pulled out and began slow climbs. But when American planes suddenly vaulted upward at near-fighter speeds, it shattered those instincts. What was supposed to be the most vulnerable moment of an engagement became the most dangerous one for the attacker. In test reports from the U.S. Naval Air Test Center at Patuxent River, engineers noted that the Helldiver's climb rate permitted immediate altitude recovery following release, superior to any previous model. That simple phrase described the foundation of an entirely new type of aerial warfare. Every technical gain translated directly into a tactical one. The Helldiver could now approach, dive, release, and escape, all without fighter protection if necessary. The same design philosophy extended across the fleet. The F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair shared similar power plants, meaning formations of bombers and fighters could perform in unison. The U.S. Navy no longer had to fight the Zero's battle on Japanese terms, and for the first time, American aircraft were dictating the tempo of combat in the Pacific. Technology alone doesn't win wars. People do. And in the Pacific skies of 1944, the men flying those dive bombers carried the weight of both engineering triumph and personal survival. American pilots who once feared Japanese fighters now flew with a quiet, earned confidence. Many were barely in their 20s, trained in advanced flight schools across Florida, Texas, and California. They practiced steep dives over painted ship silhouettes, learning to trust their instruments and the resilience of their machines. Each pilot knew his aircraft could take punishment, absorb flak, and still climb home. Lieutenant Commander James "Jig Dog" Ramage, a veteran Helldiver pilot, once described the feeling of pushing his plane into a near-vertical dive. You were falling at 250 knots, the altimeter spinning like a clock. You pulled up, and it felt like the wings would rip off. But they never did. You leveled out, and that engine just kept climbing. His words captured the balance of fear and faith that defined dive bombing in the Pacific. For Japanese pilots, the experience was entirely different. By 1944, many veterans of the early war years were gone, replaced by recruits with only a fraction of the training. The once feared Zero squadrons were flying older, overworked planes with limited maintenance support. And when these young aviators met the new generation of American bombers, the psychological impact was devastating. Reports from Japanese naval aviators describe moments of disbelief. Bombers accelerating uphill, engines roaring, machine guns blazing in defense. One pilot, Lieutenant Masao Sato, later wrote in his memoir, "We thought they would fall after their attack. Instead, they rose. We climbed after them and lost power. Our planes shook, and they disappeared above us." These encounters eroded morale faster than any propaganda campaign. Japanese pilots were trained to expect predictable prey, slow, vulnerable bombers reliant on escort fighters. What they faced instead were opponents that seemed to defy aerodynamics. Meanwhile, American crews began to take pride in this reversal. Helldiver and Dauntless squadrons painted insignias of sharks, eagles, and lightning bolts, symbols of speed and ascendancy. Pilots began calling their aircraft the beasts that climb. The phrase spread quietly through naval bases and carrier decks, becoming an unspoken symbol of the U.S. Navy's growing confidence. Each mission was still deadly. The Pacific air battles were filled with risk: anti-aircraft fire, mechanical failure, or the sea itself waiting below. Yet, every successful climb after a bombing run reinforced a simple truth. The Americans no longer feared Japanese skies. What had begun as a technological race had become a psychological victory. And by the summer of 1944, that shift in mindset would define the next great confrontation, one that would finally break Japan's air power for good. The morning. Air over the Philippine Sea shimmered with heat as two massive carrier fleets closed in across hundreds of miles of ocean. Japan had assembled its last major naval air arm, nearly 450 aircraft, a desperate attempt to halt the American advance toward the Marianas. To the Imperial Navy, this was the moment to reclaim control of the Pacific. To the Americans, it was another test of their new generation of aircraft and tactics. From the decks of carriers Lexington, Essex, and Yorktown, hundreds of U.S. Navy planes roared into the sky. Among them were the Curtiss SB2C Helldivers of Bombing Squadron 16. Each one carried a single 1,000-pound bomb beneath its fuselage, guided not by radar or computer but by human instinct, calculation, and the confidence that their machines could take them home again. As the formations reached striking distance, radar operators aboard the Enterprise picked up dozens of incoming Japanese bogies. A voice crackled through the radio. "Incoming bandits! Angels 15. The battle was on. Japanese Zeros." Escorting torpedo bombers from the carrier Zuikaku, dove to intercept what they believed were lumbering targets. Their approach was fast, organized, familiar, until it wasn't. The first wave of Helldivers didn't break formation. They held steady, waiting for the perfect angle. Then, with engines screaming, they pitched nose down in synchronized dives that cut through the cloud layer like falling arrows. The sky erupted with black puffs of anti-aircraft fire. Below, Japanese ships began to scatter. When the bombs hit, the results were immediate. Explosions rippled across the sea. Fuel lines ignited, and the water turned to fire. But the most shocking moment came seconds later, as the surviving Helldivers pulled up from their dives. Instead of turning away, they climbed, steeply, powerfully, and impossibly fast. Zero pilots chased after them, but their engines strained and lost thrust in the dense air. Several stalled and fell back toward the burning sea. Those who made it through the climb were met by a curtain of American fighter cover, F-6F Hellcats, waiting at altitude. In minutes, the hunter had become the hunted. By the end of that morning, more than 300 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed. American losses were minimal. Pilots returning to their carriers would later call it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But for those who fought it was more than an air victory. It was the moment the Pacific skies changed hands. By noon, the Pacific sky had become a graveyard of burning wrecks. Japanese pilots who once ruled the ocean air now found themselves outflown, outgunned, and outclimbed. What began as a confident strike turned into a one-sided annihilation. The Helldivers, once mocked for their sluggish handling, had proven to be the most durable and fearsome aircraft in the sky. They didn't just survive their dives, they owned them. Their turbo-supercharged engines allowed them to regain altitude almost instantly after a bombing run, a maneuver the Japanese had never trained to counter. American pilots described watching enemy fighters struggle below them, engines coughing and wings trembling as they tried to follow. The Zero's thin aluminum frame, built for agility and range, couldn't handle such steep climbs or extended bursts of power. The American bombers simply rose away, then turned, regrouped, and came back down. In squadron after squadron, reports were identical. The Helldivers dove, hit, climbed, and re-engaged. Many didn't even require fighter escort. What had once been the weakest link in a carrier task force was now its spear point. Captain Arleigh Burke, Slankitots Toritu, observing from the bridge of USS Bunker Hill, later noted in his action report, enemy fighters failed to intercept diving bombers effectively. Recovery climbs of attack aircraft were executed at rates faster than previous expectation. It was a formal way of saying what the Japanese already knew. The Americans had broken the laws of aerial combat as they understood them. As the sun began to fall, waves of smoke drifted across the sea. The Japanese carrier Hyo burned until evening, then vanished beneath the waves. American planes circled back to their task force, low on fuel but high in spirit. On the Japanese side, surviving officers sent fragmented messages back to command. Enemy bombers climb like interceptors. Impossible to engage. One intelligence officer later summarized the disaster bluntly. Their engines are stronger than ours. Their training is longer. Their courage is the same. But theirs is supported by power. In a single day, Japan had lost not just aircraft, but the myth of air superiority it had built since Pearl Harbor. The climb rate of an American bomber, a detail once considered trivial, had symbolized something much greater. It showed that American industry, science, and persistence had reached a point Japan could no longer match. The Pacific sky belonged to the United States now. When the smoke cleared over the Philippine Sea, the scale of Japan's defeat became undeniable. The Imperial Navy had lost over 90% of its attacking aircraft and most of its veteran carrier pilots. In contrast, the U.S. Navy lost fewer than 30 planes in the same engagement, many to fuel shortages or landing accidents rather than enemy fire. For American commanders, the battle was proof that years of relentless engineering and tactical refinement had paid off. The combination of radar-directed interception, disciplined formation flying, and the raw power of the new generation of aircraft had rewritten the laws of naval warfare. No longer was air combat about agility alone. It was about control, coordination, and endurance. The Curtiss SB2C Helldiver, once doubted and derided by its own pilots, had found redemption in the greatest carrier battle ever fought. It became the embodiment of American industrial strength, imperfect, but unstoppable. Its climb rate, its resilience, and its ability to survive punishment reflected the broader reality of the war. The United States could produce aircraft that were not just good, but better every month. On Japanese carriers and airfields, the aftermath was far darker. Those who returned from the battle carried stories of confusion and disbelief. Mechanics pored over damaged Zeros, searching for technical solutions that no longer existed. There was no quick fix for inferior metallurgy, dwindling resources, and inexperienced recruits. In the months that followed, Japan's air strategy collapsed into desperation. With few trained pilots and limited fuel, the Imperial Navy turned increasingly to defensive operations and, eventually, to suicide missions. the kamikaze. The contrast was stark. While Japan struggled to replace what it had lost, America continued to expand, training thousands of new pilots, launching new carriers, and perfecting the machines that had secured the skies over the Pacific. But victory wasn't just about numbers or production. It was about the psychological shift, one that would echo through every future battle of the Pacific. After the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Japanese command pieced together a sobering truth. Their once feared Zero fighters, designed for agility and range, were now relics of an outdated doctrine. Against the brute strength and mechanical endurance of American aircraft, their advantages had vanished. Official Imperial Navy records, recovered after the war, noted the shock of airmen who had faced the Helldivers and Hellcats. One report read simply, "Enemy aircraft show no weakness in climb or acceleration, impossible to intercept during ascent." For a nation that had built its strategy around swift, graceful air combat, this realization was devastating. The loss of experienced pilots compounded the crisis. Japan had no time to retrain replacements to the same standard as their fallen aces. Most new aviators received fewer than 100 hours of flight instruction before being sent into battle. In contrast, American pilots graduated with an average of 500 hours and months of combat simulation. The skies had become classrooms, and the Japanese were running out of students. Meanwhile, on American carriers, crews celebrated with quiet pride. Pilots returned to decks streaked with fuel and oil, exhausted but alive. Maintenance teams swarmed the Helldivers, patching bullet holes, checking engines, preparing for the next mission. War correspondents noted how ordinary it all seemed. Victory had become a process, not a miracle. The numbers told the story with brutal clarity. Japan lost 3 carriers, 476 aircraft, and over 3,000 men in just 2 days. The United States lost 123 men. In Tokyo, officials tried to frame the defeat as temporary. In reality, it marked the end of Japan's ability to wage offensive air warfare. The next time Japanese pilots took to the skies in large numbers, many would not plan to return. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot wasn't just an American victory. It was the death knell of Japan's air power. And at its center stood the very machines that had once been underestimated. The American dive bombers that could climb faster than fighters. Their ascent that day symbolized something greater: the irreversible rise of American dominance in the Pacific. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was more than a clash of steel and strategy. It was the moment when industrial power, engineering precision, and human endurance converged to change the balance of the Pacific forever. For years, Japanese pilots had ruled the skies with finesse and courage. They fought in fragile machines that danced through the air with elegance. But against the relentless tide of American production and adaptation, elegance wasn't enough. The war had evolved into a contest of endurance, not artistry. The image of a Helldiver climbing past a Zero became a quiet metaphor for that shift. It represented a new kind of warfare, one driven by horsepower, technology, and teamwork rather than individual heroics. Each climb told the same story. The United States had learned, adapted, and surpassed. By 1945, Japan's finest airmen were gone, their replacements flying outdated planes into impossible odds. The Americans, backed by factories running day and night, replaced their losses within weeks. Every new batch of aircraft arrived faster, stronger, and deadlier. The Pacific skies no longer belonged to one nation's daring pilots. They belonged to an unstoppable machine of progress. When historians look back, they often call the Philippine Sea the turning point of the Pacific Air War. It was. But more than that, it was the day Japan's greatest strength, its mastery of the air, became its greatest weakness. those who watched. From the decks, that June afternoon would remember the sight of silver. Bombers climbing into the sunlight, engines screaming, leaving behind trails of smoke and shattered myths. The war would rage on for another year, but the outcome was already written in the sky, in the thunder of American engines, and in the stunned silence of those who could no longer keep up. The Zero had ruled by grace, the Helldiver conquered by power, and the world of aerial warfare would never be the same again.